What's that sound? It's for amusement only, the EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast.
Welcome back to For Amusement Only. This is Nick Baldridge. So tonight I am excited. I've disassembled and removed the couch that was down in my arcade. And now I have space for 2 more pins with a good line on one and room for a second. So just thinking about various EMs I might like to have. Got a single player and a 2-player. Might be time to add a 4-player. So tonight I thought I'd talk a little bit about older machines. And by older I mean older than the 60s. We're talking Woodrails. At this time there were several different manufacturers, and Gottlieb was the undisputed king. Gottlieb consistently invented new mechanisms and new playfield toys that would keep people's interest. Some of those toys or mechanisms were a bit infuriating for some. For example, the gobble hole. A gobble hole was actually a hole in the playfield that would return the ball to the trough and would end your ball in play. Now you could shoot for these intentionally or unintentionally. Ideally, you would light special in one, and when you dropped in the lit gobble hole, you would receive a replay. However, if you're like me, you end up in the gobble hole that you really don't want to be in when it's not lit. So you get 1 point or something equally frustrating. Another wonderful example of a Woodrail toy is the Roto Target. Now the Roto Target persisted in a couple different forms through many eras of pinball. It first appeared in Woodrails and then was transplanted into EMs with metal rails, because the wood rails are EMs as well. And I have the last production game that used a Roto Target, and that's a Gottlieb Circus from 1980. So through System 1 with Close Encounters, and to System 80 with Circus, the Roto Target would appear. And in the later games, it's typically used as a novelty and less as the main focus of gameplay. But in the earlier games, there was always a reason to shoot for the Roto Target. For example, in Gottlieb's Domino Wedgehead, shooting for the Roto Target would light additional dominoes, completing a set, and then helping you to earn a special. The most notable mechanism invented during the Woodrail years is one that's still in use today, and that's flippers. Electromechanical flippers, as we know them, were invented in 1947 by Gottlieb. At the time, all machines were flipperless. Some had odd controllable kickers or other unique rebound situations, but there was nothing like the flipper. Once the flipper came onto the scene, operators started kind of freaking out, because those that had already bought their games for the year realized that they were immediately obsolete. People started looking for Humpty Dumpty, which was the first flipper game everywhere, and if your game didn't have flippers, it looked like it was antiquated, outdated. Similar to every other major change in technology that's happened in pinball. For example, the conversion to solid state from EM. Although that one I question a little bit. Because I, for one, prefer the chimes and more gentle sounds over the bleeps and bloops of the original TTL sound chips. But regardless, because the operators were freaking out, they started asking the companies what they could do to make their games more appealing. And one common trick was for, I'm not sure if it was distributors or manufacturers, to sell an aftermarket flipper upgrade kit. And what this would do was tie into an existing circuit on the machine, sometimes dangerously, and provide a space for the flipper to operate. Now, I have one Woodrail game, and it's a 1947 exhibit supply mystery. And if you've been on the Facebook group, you'll see the smashed back glass, which came with it. On this game, the operator had hacked in 2 rebound posts shaped like a flipper to act as a flipper. However, and this is the dangerous thing, they tapped into the GI circuit, basically bumping up the fuse value to a astronomical value, and the flippers, when activated, were impulse. And what this means is you have a high current draw immediately, and then power to the coil is cut off. Now, the only problem with this design is if the power doesn't cut off. So in this circuit, the idea was that the power would cut off to the flipper button immediately after it was pressed. So the cabinet flipper switch you would have to let go of and then press again in order to engage the flipper. Well, apparently that circuit had been defeated at some point in the past, and there were many burn marks under the playfield that were caused by these high-powered coils pulling off the already stressed GI circuit on this game and engaging the flippers. So my guess is that this game didn't earn a lot even after the conversion, and it was tucked away in the operator's warehouse until it was sold some many years later. But part of the reason probably for its low earnings was the dangerous way that the flippers were set up, and the fact that they probably didn't work very well for very long. The beauty of Gottlieb's design, of course, was that the flippers would be easy to maintain. And that's something that Gottlieb got very right all through the EM era, especially. They had a saying, that extra touch of quality, and it really comes through in a lot of their machines. They, as I mentioned in my episode about the 60s, they used all brass trim on the inside, where people don't even see. But that extra effort certainly goes a long way to keeping these machines alive today. And the same goes for their Woodrail era. So part of the problem that other manufacturers most likely faced is that Gottlieb held the patent for the flipper. And I've read before that David Gottlieb was fairly okay with competition using some of their ideas, and that is because he knew that competition would keep the industry alive. That said, I'm not sure how long he sat on it before he allowed others to use it. I know that other manufacturers did use an impulse style for a fairly long time. In the early days, Gottlieb really played with the placement of flippers. Their first couple games used a consistent 6 flipper layout, 3 on each side, reversed to point inwards. So as the ball traveled down the playfield, you could use the flippers, hopefully with a bit of skillful nudging, to push the ball back up the playfield a bit. Not all the way, typically, and it required a fair bit of skill in order to maneuver the ball properly to hit the high-value passive bumpers. It was Steve Kordak who designed the first machine with the typical flipper placement at the bottom that we know and love today. And that wouldn't be until 1948. For today's tech segment, I thought we could talk about the construction of flippers and how to perform repair. Your flipper is made up of several different parts. There's the flipper bat, which is visible to the player above the playfield. There's the flipper shaft, which goes through the playfield. There's the flipper bushing, which holds the shaft in an appropriate position while it rotates. And under the playfield, you've got the pawl, which is the piece that pulls the shaft. You've got the coil, which pulls the pawl. And you've got the coil sleeve, which allows the pawl to glide smoothly. You also have a coil stop, which allows the plunger to stop moving after the solenoid has energized. The stop is frequently worn down or knocked out of shape, and the plunger that matches it is also typically beat up, and both can be replaced or filed down to remove burrs. It just depends on how cheap you are. Moving beyond the units which are directly connected to the flipper, we travel to the flipper cabinet button and the flipper cabinet switch. The button itself is just a mechanism used for pressing the switch. The switch is a high-powered contact, which when closed energizes the solenoid, which pulls in the pawl and flips the flipper. Now, your flipper solenoid is actually comprised of two different coils. You have a high power, which is engaged immediately when you press the flipper cabinet switch. And then you have the low power or hold solenoid, which is activated by an end of stroke switch. So as the pawl rotates, it will push open a switch, which will cut power to the coil and allow it to hold in that position indefinitely. Now, for this discussion, we're not talking about impulse flippers. We're talking about the typical flipper that you might see in any machine. If any one of these pieces is not operating appropriately, then your flippers will lose power or have odd issues like machine gunning, where the flipper goes and moves back and forth very quickly. So as I mentioned in a previous episode, a solenoid or coil is like a big magnet, an electromagnet. And when it turns on, it pulls in a piece of metal. In this case, it's a piece of metal attached to the pawl, which pulls the shaft, which moves the flipper. However, it has to stop somewhere, or it would just shoot out the back. So a coil stop is just a piece of metal that has a small round piece welded on, and that round piece is slightly bigger than the size of the plunger that's being pulled, and the plunger smacks into it and it stops it from moving. So Ava in my last episode mentioned that Papa Card makes a lot of buzzing noise. Now, all EMs that are AC powered will buzz when you hold in the flipper buttons. However, my coil stops need to be swapped in Papa Card, and the plungers themselves might need to be replaced. I'll have to take it apart and take a look. But the coil stops haven't been changed since I've owned it, and it's received a lot of play from Ava and my other daughter, and also from many of their friends and many of my friends, so and myself. So it's probably time. So as I mentioned, all EMs that use AC power for their flippers are going to buzz somewhat, and that's nothing to be worried about. But if that buzzing becomes more and more noticeable, it's time to take it apart and shop the flippers. So how do you do that? Well, you need to take a look at the design of your flipper bat and see if there's a screw at the back. And what I do is I always take the screw out first and remove the flipper shoe, which is a plastic piece which fits over the shaft, and replace it if I'm going to do that, or just take it off and clean it very well, both inside and out. And this will prevent dirt and junk from getting on the shaft if there's some kind of dusty buildup or something inside of the flipper shoe. Next, underneath the playfield, I loosen the pawl, which holds the shaft. You do this typically with an Allen wrench. You take the shaft out, make sure it's clean, and if I'm actually replacing the flippers, which normally I'll do if I get to this point, I'll replace the shaft if it's available for that game. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The metal in the set screws, which are tightened by the Allen wrench, will bite into the metal of the shaft, and that's what holds it in place. Those Allen screws are set in two different positions. So let's say that I put everything back together, but I changed the alignment of my flipper slightly, the flipper shaft. Well, it's going to want to slide to the position it was in the first place if I don't replace the shaft. And that's because there's a big groove cut out of the shaft where the screws were tightened previously. So if I get the shaft taken out, I typically want to replace it. But examine the condition, and if everything looks okay, you can reuse it without serious penalty. Next, I take the pawl and the plunger out of the machine. If the pawl is a Bakelite material and there's wear, then I take a punch and punch out the roll pin that holds the pawl to the plunger and replace that again if it's available. And that's something that you have to often consider. Is this piece available? Don't take the pawl and the plunger apart, because it's kind of a pain to get them back together. Moving on, if the coil's in good shape, meaning that it hasn't heated up and melted the coil sleeve, then you're fine to reuse the coil. You want to examine your end-of-stroke switch contacts, and if they're pitted or worn, which is quite typical. Again, we're talking about a high amount of AC current that's flowing into these flippers. That end-of-stroke switch sees some heavy use, and again, high power tungsten contacts typically. What you can do, eventually all end-of-stroke switches will become pitted. It's just the nature of the beast. They will arc, so you'll see a spark if you watch the playfield when it's up, and that's just because of the power that's being run to them and the fact that they're AC. So what you can do is take a contact file. Some people call it an ignition file, but it's just a flat file, a metal file, that is very small, and squeeze the contacts together with the file in between them, rub it back and forth several times, inspect your work. If you can still see a pit in the contact, you want to keep going. And if you've done this several times, you probably want to replace the end-of-stroke switch. It's not very expensive, and it's usually a good idea to do so. You'll ensure that hold winding kicks in appropriately. Next, when you're gapping the end-of-stroke switch, you want to make sure that you have about 1/8 of an inch with the pawl fully extended. And that'll ensure that your power winding doesn't turn off before the ball has left the flipper. You want to examine the coil sleeve. I alluded to this earlier, but the coil sleeve is either nylon or metal. If it's a metal coil sleeve and it does not come out easily, your choice is either to replace the coil or leave it alone. Just clean it and put it back together. Now, if you go with this second approach, you risk your flipper power not being great, because the metal coil sleeves will get beat up over time, and the problem is that they get deformed and then they're very difficult to remove. So if you're having a hard time removing it, it's probably because it needs to be replaced. But if you can't get it out, you can't replace it. So in that situation, it's usually easier to replace the coil. However, it is possible to cut out a metal coil sleeve. It's just very difficult and time consuming. So you gotta wonder whether your $7 is worth your time. So, moving on, once you got your coil straight, either the sleeve replaced or cleaned, then you want to move on to your cabinet flipper switches. And again, this is a very important piece for the power to the flippers, because this is the initial jolt to the power winding of your flipper coil. These are also tungsten contacts, and they are also cleaned with an ignition file. And you'll want to file all the pits out or just replace them. And you can get new flipper switches at most any pinball vendor. So, you've done all that, put everything back together, but let's say you didn't take any photos before you took everything apart, and now you don't know where wires go to the coil, and where wires go to the end of stroke, and also where wires go to the cabinet flipper switches. Let's say you just completely missed that. Well, if you know which wires are paired together, so for example, on the cabinet flipper switch, it's probably going to be pretty obvious which ones they are. It really doesn't matter which side is soldered to which side of the switch. On the end of stroke, you got the same deal. However, on the coil, it very much does matter. And this can be resolved by reading the schematic. So looking at the schematic for Pop a Card, I see the flipper coil at the very top right, and it shows me 3 different connections. So the larger side of the coil is connected and to the power side. Then you have an orange and red wire, which is connected to the hold side and the common. So you want to make sure that that orange and red wire is wired up appropriately, and the power side is connected to the 25 volt source. And it uses the same wire color, which is black on this game, on the slingshots and various other coils that you'll see throughout the game. Oh, one other important note. The bushing I mentioned is a plastic piece that goes through the playfield, and it keeps the shaft in an appropriate position. Well, this is frequently broken, so if you've ever played a game with really sloppy flippers, or ones that are dragging on the playfield, it's either because they're just totally misadjusted, or the bushing's broken. And if the bushing's broken, that kind of thing can happen, and it'll cause all kinds of wackiness. So when I've got the whole thing disassembled, I inspect the bushings, and if they're not pretty much perfect, I go ahead and replace them. Bushings are cheap, but your playfield is not. So while you got everything apart, it's the perfect time just to take care of that. Okay, well, I think I've talked your ear off about flippers enough for tonight. My name again is Nick Baldridge. You can reach me at foramusementonlypodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online at foramusementonly.libsyn.com, or you can find us on Stitcher, iTunes, Pocket Casts, maybe other sources. I'm not sure. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.